This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Roger McEowen, K-State and Washburn law professor, begins today's show as he explains what planning problem can cause issues with protecting the legacy of family farms. K-State graduate students in the Department of Agronomy, Luiz Pradella and Claire Bott, continue the show as they discuss first hollow stem for wheat growers that use the crop as dual purpose. The Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast ends the show as Brad White, Bob Larson, and Adrienne Lulay chat about estrus synchronization and its intensity. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show discussing a blog article titled Preserving the Family Legacy. And to talk about his blog article, we have K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. Roger, thanks for joining us today.
Good to be with you.
And Roger, as we're talking about this article, as I mentioned, titled Preserving the Family Legacy, what is the biggest hindrance sometimes you see that goes unnoticed and might impact that legacy?
Oh, I think by far lack of planning, not doing anything. That seems to paralyze quite a number of people. It seems many times estate planning, succession planning, business planning, long-term care planning seems so overwhelming that people just put it off, not knowing where to start or being afraid to address some of the issues, being afraid to upset family members for whatever reason. Lack of doing anything seems to be the biggest issue that's out there.
And focusing today on that long-term care planning aspect, why is that something that's so important?
Well, because if you need long-term care, and the stats are that about 70% of those that are currently turning age 65 and looking into the future will need at least some degree and some extent of long-term care, and that care is costly. We're looking at about $130,000, $135,000 annually for nursing home care in states across the Midwest. And that's, you're looking at $11,000, $12,000 a month. That's a chunk. And if you haven't done anything to plan for that, you could get to the point with an extended stay and an extended need for long-term care that you start eating up assets that your plan was to transfer to the next generation. Those might be farm assets, could be farmland, farm machinery and equipment, livestock, and that kind of could be very detrimental to your long-term business succession plan.
And you mentioned turning 65, and with that, I think about Medicare. Does that do anything for producers?
Well, Medicare generally only covers short-term rehabilitative care, and then only 100% of the rehabilitative care for the first 20 days. And so after that expires, then most families that don't have the assets or resources or didn't do planning will look to Medicaid. But Medicaid is a means-tested program that's designed for the indigent. And so what I mean by that is an applicant has to have very few cannibal assets to qualify. Typically, your spend down requirement is you've got to spend your own resources and your income down to about $2,000 before you can be eligible for public assistance benefits in the form of Medicaid.
And having the assets that low, is that something they would just need to do right before they would apply for Medicaid?
Well, there's a 5-year look back, and so you can't just transfer your assets away without compensation, without receiving fair market value for them within 5 years of making an application for Medicaid. If you do, those assets the value of those assets are still deemed to be available for you for Medicaid eligibility purposes. So, for example, let's say 2 years ago, I make a Medicaid application, but 2 years ago I transferred property worth $250,000 away, just gifted it away to my kids. Well, the Medicaid agency, the state agency that runs this combined state-federal program, is going to look back, catch that transfer, and say, well, the cost of nursing home care in the state is $125,000 a year. You're disqualified for Medicaid for 2 years. Now, providing I don't have any other assets, they're going to catch that transfer, and I'm going to have to private pay somehow for 2 years before Medicaid kicks in. That's the application of what's known as the penalty period.
And what about for assets like the gift tax? Does it need to be worried about being taxed or used within that 5-year look back?
Well, that's a good question, because those are two separate things. The present interest annual exclusion for federal gift tax purposes is $19,000 per recipient this year. That is totally distinct from the Medicaid rules. So I could gift $19,000 to someone without having to file a federal gift tax return. But if I'm gifting non-exempt assets of any amount, that triggers a Medicaid penalty if I make those transfers within 5 years of that Medicaid application.
So for producers who are looking into Medicaid but also want to have control of their assets still, is there an option for them?
I think the premier option is what's known as a Medicaid Asset Protection Trust, or MAPT, or MAPT. It's an irrevocable trust, and once I transfer assets into the trust, then I no longer own those assets for Medicaid eligibility purposes. But the beauty of this is that the trust can be structured to have specific protections in it, which many times farmers will want in these situations. I could retain, for example, the right to live in the farmhouse for the rest of my life. And I could also have the trust drafted so that it's an income-only trust, which would allow me to continue receiving rent from the land or dividends from investments held by the trust. And if it's drafted correctly, it's still deemed to be what we call in the tax trade a grantor trust. And so my heirs would get a basis in the trust assets upon my death equal to the asset's fair market value at the time of my death. And that would potentially save hundreds of thousands in capital gain taxes if that land is eventually sold. So you get inclusion in your estate. It's usually not a problem for people because the $15 million exemption right now, most people are going to be underneath that, which means you get a basis step up in the hands of your heirs, and the assets are still not deemed to be available for Medicaid eligibility purposes.
So if we're working to make things invisible to Medicaid, does that impact how things might work with the IRS?
Well, we've got Medicaid rules and we have IRS rules, and they're different. And the IRS views things differently than the agencies that are responsible for Medicaid. IRS doesn't care about the Medicaid no access rule. There are specific rules in the tax code that govern the tax treatment of trust assets, and those provisions focus on whether the grantor retained what we call sufficient strings over the assets or incidents of ownership. And that can be done by the clause language that's drafted into the trust to give the grantor possession, enjoyment, or the right to the income from the property that's put in the trust, and that'll cause inclusion in the estate. Medicaid doesn't care about that. They don't care if you retain that type of an interest. So what they care about is whether you have access to the corpus or the principal of the trust, not the income, but the corpus. And so you can be shielded from having access to the principal, but still benefit financially from the assets in the trust, and it will not cause a problem with your Medicaid eligibility.
So with the Medicaid Asset Protection Trust, that would need to be done before that 5-year look-back period?
Oh, yeah. You want to do those while you're healthy. The sooner the better is always the thing to keep in mind with respect to that. But yeah, you don't want to wait until it's too late. If you create the trust, transfer the assets into the trust, and then apply for Medicaid within 5 years, that's deemed to be a transfer that the Medicaid agencies can grab. So you've got to create the trust. That'll get the 5-year clock starting the moment the assets are deeded into the trust. So the best time to plan, as always, is while you're healthy and have no immediate need for care.
Is there ever a time that's per se maybe too early for someone to do this?
That's an interesting question because there's two ways to look at this. One is we seem to have a misconception that the only people that need long-term care are older people. That's clearly not the case. If you look at the most famous court cases that are out there, even stretching from the U.S. Supreme Court back down through the federal courts, the most prominent cases have all involved young women. The first case that comes to mind is Karen Ann Quinlan. That was back in the 1970s. That was a drug overdose. There was a case out of Joplin, Missouri, which was a car accident. And the individual ended up in a vegetative state, needed long-term care. That was a young lady. There was the Florida case about 27 years ago. And she became incapacitated, and the battle was over whether her ex-husband or her parents could make her medical decisions. Well, those are all kind of like medical decision cases, but they all required long-term care. So is it ever too early? Technically, no. But most young people don't think about these things because they're not thinking of their potential demise. Shelby, as we're younger, we think that we're immortal, we're going to live forever, and these issues aren't highlighted until we get older and more mature and then come to an understanding. I'm not going to live forever, and I need to get my things in order. So the answer to your question is no, it's never too early, but it takes on greater importance as a person ages.
And while we're thinking about all this planning, do we also need to take into consideration spouses or children?
Yeah, effective planning is not just about hiding assets. It's about business continuity. So if you have a spouse that enters care while the other spouse stays at home on the farm, that spouse is known as the community spouse. And they are entitled to what's known as a resource allowance. And they can keep presently up to $162,660 in countable assets, plus the home and certain income protections. That's really the best position as far as Medicaid is concerned, if there is a spouse at home. And there's also a caregiver child exception. And so there are situations where if a child has lived in the parent's home for at least 2 years and provided care that kept the parent out of a nursing home, the home may be transferred to that child without violating the look-back rule. But in any instance, waiting to put your plan in place can be costly. And we always have to keep that in mind.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having me.
That was K-State and Washburn law professor Roger McEowen. His blog article titled Preserving the Family Legacy will be linked in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing first hollow stem in wheat. And then to talk about it, we're joined by PhD student Luiz Pradella and master student Claire Bott, both in K-State's Department of Agronomy. Luiz, Claire, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today.
Happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having us.
Claire, what is first hollow stem?
So first hollow stem is a growth stage that we look for in our wheat to know when we need to remove cattle from these dual-purpose wheat fields. So this is something you can measure by going out into your field. You find an ungrazed wheat stem. So this is something you might look along your fence lines and find a wheat plant that has not been grazed down. You're going to find the main stem of that plant and split the stem lengthwise down the middle. When you do this, you can identify where the developing wheat head is, where that growing point is, and there'll be a hollow space that develops underneath it. And that's what we call the first hollow stem.
And why are we caring about getting cattle off of wheat pastures when first hollow stem has occurred?
Sure, yeah, that's something. So once we start seeing this hollow stem, it means that our growing point, that developing head, is now above the soil surface, and now it's at risk of being damaged, or in this case, grazed off. So if you remove that developing wheat head, you've removed that stem's ability to produce a head, produce a grain. So you really want to make sure that you're protecting that as it comes above the ground. And as you continue grazing past this point and removing those wheat heads and damaging that wheat, you're really severely impacting your wheat yield. So even a single day that you leave these cattle on the field, letting them graze beyond the recommended point, you are losing grain yield, up to even 2% of your grain yield being lost every day that you keep those cattle on the field.
For this growing season, we've talked a little bit about wheat having maybe more tillers or there just being more mass out there. Does that make an impact on first hollow stem?
In terms of the tiller number, I don't think that's going to impact your hollow stem per se, because you do want to keep track of this in the main stem. However, the warm winter that we've been having does lead to the fact that our wheat plants are developing earlier in the spring, and this hollow stem is therefore developing earlier than we do see in some cooler years.
So, Luiz, Claire mentioned wanting to maybe check those fence lines because wanting to find a place cattle haven't grazed it off. But if we're checking fence lines, should we check multiple fence lines to take into account field variability?
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, the average of the hollow stem height that you observe will depend of the number of samples that you observe. So, conventionally we recommend that the farm go to out of a grazed area, out of the fence, and sample plants. But the most important thing that I would say is collect your shot and look for your most developed chiller, the first chiller, the oldest chiller, and then use this chiller to measure. Once you split this chiller and you measure the distance between the crown to the head, and you can observe that this hollow is longer of 1.5 centimeters. It's would be the same diameter than a dime, like a 10 cents coin that we use as a reference. That would be the moment to remove the cattle. So we don't have like a specific number for samples, but for example, in our program, we sample 40 stems for each variety that we are sharing the results. So I would say that it's good to double check. Just one would not be enough. Maybe 10 would be like a good value to have a reference, but more is better.
And when we're looking at those different stems and tillers, if one tiller has reached first hollow stem, does that mean it's time to go and pull the cattle off or wait for all of those to reach first hollow stem?
Yeah, that's a good question. Conventionally, we use this most developed chiller, the main chiller, the main stem, especially because it's a good indicator that once the cattle is eating, is grazing, they can assess the developing head. So it's a good reference to know that at this point, your cattle will start to penalize your wheat grain yield because they will be removing the heads. So we know that the chillers will present different growth stages. But for this reason, we have as a reference the first stem, the first hollow stem, to be sure that we will not be penalizing those chillers.
Absolutely. We want that first hollow stem in the first one you observe is very important because we want to be proactive here. It is better to be a little proactive and avoid losing grain yield because even one additional day that you graze, the little bit of forage that you gain in that day is not going to economically outweigh the losses of grain yield. So it's important to be proactive here. So if you are measuring it in one stem, that is a good indicator that you have reached this first hollow stem and you want to get cattle out.
If growers are going out and checking their fields and let's say on Monday there is no first hollow stem, when's the next time they should check to see if there is one?
So it is a cumulative process, I suppose you could say. This hollow stem starts at 0 and then it keeps growing up. And then we use this point of 1.5 centimeters, as Luiz mentioned, to be the time to remove cattle. So I guess that depends. If you go out to your field and you measure that it's at 1.3 centimeters, you're pretty darn close. And you might want to measure tomorrow or the next day even. If you go out to the field and you aren't seeing any hollow stem at all, that means, well, maybe you can wait until next week and get away with that.
Do you see a lot of variability for wheat growers if they've planted the same variety in neighboring fields or have planted that variety for multiple years, there being a big difference when it comes to when they've reached that point of 1.5 centimeters?
Yeah, that's a great question. In general, I would say that closed fields will present like similar or pretty close values in terms of first hollow stem, but we can also observe like special gradient effect. We have a very interesting tool in the Kansas system, the Mesonet system, where we have like a predictive model that is used to estimate the percentage of the chillers or cultivars that have achieved the first hollow stem per region. And I would say that it of course has a field variability, We strongly recommend that the farmer or the decision maker measure it by field. But we can also mention that we have like a variability comparing seasons. If you compare the same day of the year across seasons, we can observe different measurements. And also we can observe that we achieve that stage, the first holly stand, first in your southeast, south central Kansas regions, then compared with, for example, north central or northwest regions.
So in our e-update articles where people can find the first hollow stem updates as you guys are going out there and looking, are you seeing varieties having first hollow stem and reaching that 1.5 centimeters?
Yesterday, we had the opportunity to sample and measure our 12 varieties that were planted in Hudson, in the South Central Experimental Field. It's really near Hudson. And 5 of those 12 varieties have reached the first holly stem stage. They are longer than 1.5 centimeters. And yeah, it's really interesting to know that, moreover, all other varieties already start the stand elongation, so we can observe this hollow stand. It's not 1.5 centimeters yet, but we strongly recommend the farmers to pay attention on that, especially because, as Claire mentioned it before, in a couple or a few days, it's a really quick process, so once we start to observe the stand elongation, probably the variety will achieve the first holly stand stage so quickly, like soon. So we really recommend, especially, our southeast and south central farms to pay attention on their varieties, because I would say that 50% of our varieties already achieve the first holly stand stage,
What are some of the key takeaways you do have for growers then?
So yeah, really interesting thing is that most of the works that we have in this South Great Plains region, where the dual purpose wheat is very common, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, we have like a relation of penalties, losses of 1 to 5% of the grain yield that would be attainable per day of grazing. It means that it's really important to put your cattle off of this grazing process when we achieve the first hollow stem, because you have like really strong penalties at the end of your season if you don't take them off at the appropriate time. I think that 1 to 5% per day is a really significant impact in your profitability.
That was PhD student Luiz Pradella and master's student Claire Bott, both in K-State's Department of Agronomy. In today's show notes on agtoday.net, I will link e-update articles related to first hollow stem. If you'd like to find them for yourself, you can do so by going to eupdate.agronomy.ksu.edu. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast with Brad, Bob, and Adrienne.
For years, we talked about heat detection, finding heats, and now we're actually starting to talk about the potential, the intensity of those heats, especially as we use timed AI programs. Mm-hmm. And what does it mean when people are putting that together and saying the intensity of heat expression? And then I want to turn to Adrienne on where she's done some work in that area.
Well, I always like to answer a different question than you ask.
I know. But, that's why I don't even bother to come up with a good question.
There's a couple of things. One is even the timing. When we first started coming out with some synchronization protocols, we didn't attempt to do breeding by appointment or timed insemination. And so it involved several days of estrus detection. And it became really obvious that, the heifers and the cows don't read the textbook, and they come in over a pretty long range of time. Now, with some advancements in the protocols, we got that down a lot tighter, and that's when we really, the timed insemination protocols became by far the norm. But remember that those cows and heifers don't read the textbook, and they don't all come in at the same time. And so as, again, these protocols continue to improve, there's a couple of things. One is the timing, and we recognize that maybe we can adjust these protocols a little bit for those heifers or cows that are a little bit behind the rest of the herd as far as when they express estrus. And then the estrus intensity is an area where a couple of papers, including Adriana, have looked at the intensity. And again, you kind of go back to the old days when we bred off of estrus all the time, and it was obvious that, some of them have much, express estrus much more intensely. It was easier to figure out, should I breed her or not? And some of the others, you were kind of scratching your head trying to figure out the timing.
Well, it could be driven by hormone levels, or a variety of things. Adrienne, what's been your experience with this?
I like to tell people that the stronger the heat, the stronger the follicle, more estrogen. So they're going to be showing that estrus activity, intensity better. And then that's what's building you a better corpus luteum, which is, going to affect how your pregnancy rates are. So I think a lot of it is just kind of being able to read what's going on in the cow. And luckily we have a way to kind of see that from the outside.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the challenges when we talked about, and I started with heat detection because I can remember going through training with heat detection, and you're looking at the sexually active group in the pen and you're trying to figure out who's in heat and is she really in heat. And at that time, you weren't doing a lot of fixed time AI. So you'd try to pick out the one, and then you'd use the AM/PM rule, why did that rule exist, Bob?
Yeah, really, there's several steps that are important to get a good fertilized egg. One is the semen has a longer lifespan than the egg does. And the semen actually, the moment it enters the reproductive tract of the female, is not quite ready to fertilize that egg yet. It takes several hours to do what's called capacitation, to become ready to fertilize the egg. And so when you start figuring out, okay, when do cows typically ovulate relative to when they start showing estrus, and how long does it take that sperm to capacitate, and how long will the sperm live, and you put all that into your thought process, and you come up with, it's about ideal, usually, if they'll read the textbook, to breed the females about 12 hours after they're first detected in estrus. So that's where that AM/PM rule, and it's a good place to start.
So, Adrienne, does that fit in with as you talk about intensity of estrus? When we're watching, it takes a significant amount of time that you'd have to be watching, and it's hard to gauge intensity. How are you measuring that?
If you are just heat detecting without any, patches or markers or anything like that, you're watching for the secondary signs of heat that preclude the standing heat. And then by adding in estrus detection aids, you can start seeing when they were actually standing to be ridden by another cow, because that estrus detection patch is going to progressively get more and more burnished off. Yeah, it kind of allows you to say, maybe she just started, or man, that thing's burnished off. She's been standing for a while. And if you're not out there, looking at your cows every hour or so, then it helps you pinpoint that to then time your AI after that.
Once again, that was part of BCI's Cattle Chat podcast. That's what we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.